Good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and I am back with another video for the Roanoke Valley Chess Club. And today we're going to be doing a review of a great game of the past, and I've gotten a new book. It's this one. It is a game collection of Nezhmetdinov's best games of chess, and I may or may not whenever I do these, put these in their own separate playlist. For the games of certain players, I may get Fischer 60 memorable games, a collection of Kasparovs, Karpovs, and a few other players. But today we're going to be reviewing the first game in this book, which was between Nezhmetdinov, with the black pieces actually, versus, I forget the guy's first name, but Samsonov as white. And this game was played in Kazan in Russia, and I want to say the 30s. So it's a bit old, and some of the theory is a bit antiquated, so a lot of that got cut out, but the variations that I've given, with I think one exception, are actually the variations that Nezhmetdinov put in his annotations. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Oops, sorry about that. Come on now. There we go. E4 was played by Samsonov, and we got a classic open game. And this is always a fun thing. And we get a Vienna. So we follow a main line, and before I go any further, Nezhmetdinov mentions this variation that was preferred by Aliekin, which leads to a wild and crazy game. Of course, if knight takes knight, d5, and you regain the piece. So queen h4, and then there's a few variations. Bishop b3 is considered best, and you get this position, which is known to be beneficial to black, believe it or not. Even though if the queen ever returns to e8, it's going to look like a scholastic tournament where they don't know how to set up the pieces. So we go back, and actually it would be here. Queen e5 is a variation that is also known to be good for black after black plays c6 and then d5. The position is solid for black, and black won't have any real problems developing. And the ending will probably wind up being a draw. So just a few variations of note. Instead, f4 was played in the game, which is the main line. It's the Vienna gambit, and it has a lot of similarities to certain king's gambit positions. But d5 was chosen, and after pawn takes e5, knight takes e4, we have knight f3 was played. Now, some of the alternatives that have been chosen in this position include queen f3 and queen e2. However, knight f3 was the main move, and it still is as far as I'm aware. And there are a few alternatives. Bishop b4 was played in game. However, bishop e7 is mentioned by Nezhmetdinov as a bit more mainstream. Oops, sorry about that. And knight c6 he mentions as an interesting poison pawn variation, which gets really complicated. And as we can see, black should have an edge in the ending. And what's the material situation? 2 pawns down, 2 pawns out. Bishop and knight versus the 2 bishops. I'm not sure if I would evaluate this the same way that Nezhmetdinov did, but at the same time, black is better developed. Black has more space. That pawn on e5 is really weak. The pawn on e4, on the other hand, isn't weak. Pawn on a6 is hanging, but I would probably take the black pieces here. So it's an interesting variation. So it is something to be aware of. Knight f3 was chosen, bishop b4, and then bishop e2 is also a known move. However, queen e2 was played in game, and Nezhmetdinov took, which was recaptured in the standard way. Of course, you always do want to capture in the center and towards the center. And I'm sure that Nezhmetdinov actually saw queen b5 check here, which was played. But he mentions that in his early days, he wanted activity at all costs. Material was not really his big concern. And he actually says that queen b5 was a bit of an error from white, and that bishop a3 would have been a much better option, and that black actually gets some play for this, because at the end of the day, black has some issues right now. The f-pawn is weak. Of course, the entire 7th is fairly weak. He has an isolated queen pawn, which is not going to play very well, especially against white center. The bishop's going to be better than the knight. And white's king safety isn't fantastic. A move like f6 could be met with d3, knight d6, stuff like that. And I can see a situation in which white gains an edge here in this position. However, this may have been a slight inaccuracy, or just Nezhmetdinov demonstrating that white can get an attack if black plays inaccurately. And instead, the editors of the book mention queen c7 as a significant alternative, where black is doing very well here, and is up in exchange, actually. So, just, I think that Nezhmetdinov's annotation with the with the pawn takes queen is to demonstrate just the power of just the fact that white can get a very good position if black doesn't find this move, which, knowing the style that Nezhmetdinov plays, yeah, black's going to find this move. Anyway, so let's go back to the game in which queen b5 was chosen. Nezhmetdinov actually says that his move was slightly inaccurate and that he should have played knight to c6, because after queen b7, which I'm figuring Samsonov would have played, you castle, you give up the knight, and there's a few variations. Actually, the editors mentioned that even after h4, bishop g4, black still has an edge because of the king in the center and the superior development of the black pieces. And instead, Nezhmetdinov gives g4, and black's game is dominating, and white is basically bust here. So Nezhmetdinov favored knight c6 in retrospect. But c6 is interesting because after queen takes b7, bishop takes, Nezhmetdinov mentions white should have tried this exchange sacrifice, which actually gives white some good chances, because white has a much better center, and his king isn't unsafe in this variation because the queens are off, and black's given up all his development in order to win a rook that... Yeah, and with the two bishops, a better center, and enough open files, I agree. White does stand better. So that should have been chosen instead of what happened in game, which was white got greedy, and here is an interesting move, and we see the worst move possible, but here's what Nezhmetdinov recommended instead, which was bishop takes bishop. Queen here, he mentions that king d1 is very bad because of this line, and, well, black is winning. He's starting to checkmate, and he's starting to win a lot of material, and the situation just isn't fantastic for the situation is not good for white. White's about to get checkmated, basically. And I think there was an alternative. Oh, yeah, it was not there. It wasn't king there. It was king to e2 being the main line. And after queen here, king d3 leads to knight c5 checkmate. King d1, castles, as in the other variation, bishop takes. And actually, even Nezhmetdinov says, yeah, it's probably a perpetual here. But instead, white played this move. And, you know, you can criticize a lot of these not so great players that, you know, a lot of famous players played against for not necessarily defending the best. Because, well, they didn't. And it's why a lot of really strong players today don't have the highest opinion of Morphy. They think his games are great for teaching beginners to get your pieces out and to learn how to defend and for teaching basic tactics and all that stuff. And a lot of the players before Steinitz, and a lot of them don't even have a high regard for Steinitz, which is fair because Steinitz was, yeah, I think he had one good game, and that was the famous Steinitz von Bardeleben game, which I may cover at some point. But a lot of them will say, yeah, Morphy was at most 2200 strength, and I strongly doubt that because, well, he crushed everyone who was considered good in that day. He crushed Blackburn, he crushed Bird, who wasn't fantastic, but Bird was considered a master back in the day. He destroyed the person who was considered the best player in the world at the time in Adolf Anderssen. Wasn't just a demolition. Like, in Adolf Anderssen, after the London 1851 tournament, was actually considered the world champion. And Morphy just demolished him. And Anderson has a lifetime plus score against Steinitz, the first official world champion. And I always hate that. And maybe I'll talk about that because I actually consider the first world champion Le Bourdonnais. Because his matches against MacDonald from Scotland were actually billed as world championship matches. So I think, and there was no real strong organization of strong players playing against each other up until that point. You know, you can maybe make the argument for Philidor, but he was more of a theoretician, especially an ending theoretician. But the Le Bourdonnais MacDonald matches were, sure, they may have had some iffy situations and some iffy moves played, but again, that was the style of the day, and the players, you know, opening theory was still the very wild, wild west and all that stuff, but I consider Le Bourdonnais the first world champion, followed by Adolf Anderssen, and then, of course, Morphy, and after that, then we can talk about Steinitz. But anyway, moving back to this game, this is definitely a helpmate, and I've rambled on long enough for you to actually find it, and Nezhmetdinov actually says this is the only time he ever got this type of checkmate. And it's this most simple pattern ever. And it's, of course, you know, on every chess forum you're going to find these, and it's basically a just reset the clock, 0 days since last smothered mate. And, I mean, it's actually kind of rare to see a smothered mate in the middle of the board. Typically, we're talking about a smothered mate in the corner, where the king ends up on h1 or even a1. I've seen a lot of those. But for a king to actually end up in the center of the board on a smothered mate is actually quite rare, and it's not common at all. And, of course, as we're looking at the board, it was a queen for one piece. A queen and a rook for one piece. So, down an exchange and down a queen in terms of the material count, and if we're counting versus 6 versus 6. So the pawns are equal, and black is down in exchange, but black is also down a queen, and yet he still achieved checkmate. But learning the tactics is always important, and that's kind of what this game shows, is not only do you have to play, the opening well and get a solid position out of the opening, but you have to capitalize on it, and you have to develop your pieces. So you can't, and that's actually why Nezhmetdinov criticized this move c6, is he didn't develop a piece. And then what do you do when you're attacking? Well, you trade off your opponent's defenders. Turns out that white didn't want to trade off, take those pieces that were on the king's side, but, it happens. So, anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.